Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first peer learning session on disaster risk knowledge in the Pacific, innovations in Pacific disaster risk knowledge. This is going to be a very, I think, interactive and exciting session, so we're glad to have all of you folks here with us. And as Jutta says, looking forward to an interesting session today. I've got a few things just for us to keep in mind as we get our session started. So if you're not speaking, do keep your mic muted just so that we can avoid any audio issues. We're going to hear from a number of people who will be sharing, and then there will be opportunities to ask questions or to get answers from those people. Feel free to send your questions to the chat at any point, right? So we encourage that. It's actually really useful to have a few questions ready to go when we go into the Q&A. And if you'd like to make an intervention, if you'd like to take the floor, you can find the raise hand button under reaction. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see reactions and you'll see raise hand under there. And that's how you can make an intervention from the floor. So a few ground rules. A little bit about the peer learning session. So the Pacific Disaster Risk Knowledge Series, Disaster Risk Knowledge in the Pacific, Vital Information for Resilience, for Resilient Development, is a series that is co-hosted by ADB and the Pacific community. We're going to have three peer learning sessions that are part of this. And really, this is an opportunity for Pacific government staff, regional experts, and users of climate and disaster risk information to network, to learn from each other, to hear about case studies and examples. And participants who complete the program will receive a certificate. So very important, I think, for everyone to know here is the people who are here in the session are selected, right? So not anyone can join this. You took part in an application, and everyone who is here is doing work or is planning or interested in doing work specifically around this area. And that's why it is a series of peer learning sessions. Now, for today's agenda, this is a little bit of what it's going to look like. We're going to get an overview of risk information. We're going to create a little bit of a space for people to get to know each other, right? So we want to ensure that you get to meet a few of the other people who've joined this program. We're going to hear about sources of risk information and risk assessments in the Pacific, ADB's development of risk information. We're going to hear from a few specific examples or case studies of that. And then we're going to have some reflections from you, and we'd love to hear some of your takeaways from that session. So that's a little bit of how we're going to be spending the next hour and 15 minutes. But before we get to that, I have a question for everyone here. And what I'd love for you to share is, how is risk information applied in your country or agency? So take a moment, open up the chat at the bottom, and go ahead and type in, how is risk information currently applied in your country or agency? Maybe it's not yet applied, right? And that's fine as well. Are there specific areas where you're seeing it applied, or there's plans to do that? We'd love to hear that. So take a moment, head to the chat, and tell us a little bit about how risk information is applied in your country. And for this, just a short answer will do. So you don't need to write too much detail. This is just to get an idea of how it's applied in each of our countries. Okay, so we've got a few responses. It looks like we'll be keeping this more for the discussions in that case. But we have in developing early warning systems. So thanks for from Litea. We have from USPIOE, risk information has yet to be applied. Hopefully after this program, we can have plans to improve that. That would be fantastic. And then JB says early warning system, modern technologies, and workshops. Interesting, very interesting. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for sharing that. And I hope we can dig deeper into those. What I'd like to do now, though, is to hand things over to our moderator for today, who is Alexandra Galarpin, who is the Senior Disaster Risk Management Specialist with the Pacific Regional Department at the Asian Development Bank. Alexandra, over to you.
Yes, good morning, everybody. So it's very nice to see you this morning, this afternoon in this room. Let's get started right away. We're going to have a very brief recap on risk information, and the person to introduce this will be Stuart Fraser. Stuart is an expert in disaster risk analytics with a background in the insurance industry. He's worked for multiple agencies, including for ADB in the last 4 to 5 years in the Pacific, and he has a PhD in emergency management. So Stuart will very briefly discuss and give you an overview of how we define disaster risk, how we analyze and measure it, and what we actually use it for. Over to you, Stuart.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra. So I'll try to distill lots of information into the next 5 minutes and 2 slides here, just to get everybody up to some kind of level of background information. So when we're talking about disaster risk, we're looking at the potential loss of life, injuries, livelihoods being affected, assets being damaged or destroyed, or systems being affected, or communities being suffering some kind of disruption, and looking at the severity of that disruption, that impact within a specific time period. So it might be looking at the potential level of impact in the next 10 years or a given in any given year or any given 10-year period. So when we're talking about risk, we're thinking about 3 components: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability generally. So the hazard information describes the locations that might be affected by an event and how strong or intense that event might be. And we'll talk about intensity of events in terms of, say, flood depth, wind speed, earthquake, ground shaking. And within hazard, we're thinking about how severe events might be in that certain time period. Exposure refers to the assets of the built environment or the natural environment and population, where they're located, what their characteristics are, whether that's social characteristics or structural construction, use type, and the cost to repair or replace buildings. And the vulnerability component links the 2 together. So it relates the hazard intensity at a location to the impact on an asset or on the population. So we can have structural vulnerability when we're talking about roads, power networks, schools, hospitals, homes, or we can have social vulnerability when we're looking at how vulnerable a community or certain group of people are. So we look to identify and understand risk through risk assessment, and we use those to raise awareness of risk or trigger dialogue with a view to taking actions. And the information that comes out of risk assessments informs decisions on investing in risk prevention, risk reduction, and adaptation. It can inform DRR, so disaster risk reduction policies. Helps us prioritize and design particular investments. It might be protection to a particular part of particular key infrastructure, like an airport or a port, or it might be to inform urban development. And by putting a cost or a value on the risk and the potential impact, we can start to look at the benefits of avoided losses versus the costs of making those investments. We can also use a risk assessment and risk information in preparedness, so planning and designing early warning systems, evacuation routes, potential shelters, in designing financial protection. It might be insurance or contingent financing or risk pools, for example. And we can also use it to inform resilient recovery and base recovery and reconstruction plans around estimates of what might happen in a set of given events. So how do we develop risk information? So experience and observations is the basis, but generally we have very short historical records and they tend to be quite incomplete. So we can build a picture of risk from that experience, but we tend to use models to provide a longer time series over which to look at the impacts. And we can use statistics based on past observations of event severity and frequency and past losses, or we can simulate the physical processes of events and simulate effectively plausible events that we may not have experienced before, or we may not have recorded the impacts of before. And then we model the interaction of hazards with assets and bring in that vulnerability component. And we can accumulate the impacts across different sectors. We can look at the losses that can be incurred from different hazards. And on the bottom of that chart there's an example from a recent output showing the risk estimates for different time periods for different parts of different sectors and different types of buildings. We can also provide indexes, so providing relative view of risk, let's say for different villages on an island or in a country, or different wards. We can provide hazard maps, providing estimating the footprint of flood depth, for example, or wind speed. We can look at mapping the number of assets, people, and the value that could be affected by different events and different hazards. And then we can look at the impact assessment, the potential impact from key historical losses or hypothetical worst case scenarios. And then we get onto the risk assessment, which provides us an estimate of the maximum loss that might occur within a 100-year period or a 10-year period. Within these risk assessments, we can also include projected change in risk. So the dynamics due to climate change, due to changing building codes and urban development and different values, changing social vulnerability in the populations as well. So we can look at various different scenarios and how different scenarios might affect the risk. So I'll stop there, but hopefully that provides somewhat of the base for the discussion for the rest of the session and the next events. Thanks, Alexandra.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stuart. So to wrap that into 5 minutes, this is not a small feat. And just for everybody, this has been a lot of information, of course, but extremely condensed. But as we move through the event today and as we move through this series, we will go back to these questions, see more tangible examples as well of the different activities and outputs that Stuart has talked about. So again, thanks a lot. Before we actually break for the get to know each other, I would like to acknowledge that there's 2 more contributions that has come in the chat box in terms of what to use or what the participants are currently using disaster risk information for. And there's John Rubin. I believe John is from Vanuatu. And he says, in developing climate information services for climate sensitive sectors in Vanuatu. That is very interesting, John, and we're looking forward to hearing more about that for sure. And then Ruhit Karan-Singh from Fiji reflects on the role of the NDMO in this and how the NDMO is basically interacting with other agencies, with layers in the government, and roles and responsibilities, including in digesting and collecting disaster risk information. And NGOs also play a role, and of course the Weather Office. So many thanks for that. If other people want to add on to this, please feel free. But our next agenda point now is we're going to break into smaller groups. And we'd like you to introduce yourself in 60 seconds or even less. So basically reflect on which country you're from, what organization you are representing, and what your role is. Please, if you can, if the bandwidth allows it, turn on your webcam so that we can put a name to an image.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alexandra. So we're going to open up the breakout rooms, and go ahead and introduce yourself, as Alexandra mentioned, and get to know some of the other people who are part of this program and who will be joining us for the next few sessions. We're opening up the breakouts now.
Okay. Carl, I think we're good, right? So yes, the next activity is we would like to have a group photo of all the participants and speakers. So if you could please turn on your camera and then smile. And the Tandemic team will try to take a wonderful picture of all of us.
Yeah, okay. So I've got one picture of us smiling. Maybe we do one where we're waving.
Okay.
Fantastic. So we got that one as well. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so with the group photo done and everybody having an idea of who else is in the session, at least 2 or 3 people that they've come to know, we'd like to now head into the main part really of the program with some very interesting presentations and interesting presenters. But before we do that, regarding the first 2 presentations, if you could put in the chat box what you would be particularly interested in terms of the first topic, which is sources of risk information in the Pacific, any burning question you might have with regard to that. And the second one, any questions that, or any particular aspects you'd be interested in terms of ADB's involvement in risk assessment and risk information. So if you want to put that into the chat box, that would be great. I think we'll just go ahead and leave the chat box open for your reflections, just as we did last time. So let's go to our first speaker, and that is Litea Biukoto. I hope I pronounce your name correctly, Litea. If not, please correct me. So she is a regional expert and the team leader of the disaster risk team in the Pacific community. I don't really think she needs a lot of introduction. She has over 15 years of working in the region on disaster risk reductions, and she's particularly engaged and interested in the application of risk information. It's a topic we'll look at in more depth in the second session of this series. And she's interested in assessment tools in decision making. She represents the Pacific in a big number of expert groups and thematic groups. But anyways, we're looking forward to hearing from you, Litea. Over to you.
Alexandra. I really just wanted to just share with you, areas in where you're able to actually access some of the risk information that's been collated in the region. And this work really began out of some discussions with, between countries, with countries, and with partners around how much was actually available in the public domain. And if we were going to be working with countries, where would we be able to actually access this data from? So I'm actually going to go back to some legacy work, and the Pacific Disaster Net is one of these, which was really developed when countries were at the forefront of actually developing strategies to address disaster risk reduction, and where they could actually go to for source information. And this document library is, as I said, in the public domain. What it does really, really nicely is that it actually brings together documents that don't even exist in digital format. And there's been a bit of time spent in trying to actually source these from different areas for people who've tried to actually access and gain reports or documents that have been referenced. It can be quite tricky given the number of URLs that you would need to be steered towards. And sometimes some of these, if they do not exist online, do need to be put online in some other format. The work that we've done around disaster statistics was really a need or a drive from the Pacific to be able to document this, and in trying to understand what were the impacts of disasters in terms of the damage and loss across the sectors. And how could we actually measure whether or not that the Pacific had actually started to gain some progress in terms of the risk reduction interventions that had been put in place. At the bottom of the screens for each of these, I've put in the URL. We will circulate these so you'll actually have a chance to browse through this. For the countries who have been reporting against the Sendai framework, there's a direct link between the disaster loss database that's hosted through Desinventa to your Sendai reporting. And thanks to the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, where they've provided direct support to countries in being able to collate a lot of these statistics and then uploading it so that it is indeed counted for countries. And so the disaster stats, include damages in terms of the monetary loss, but it also talks about the actual impact to the sector. So, the number of households, how many people were displaced or evacuated, what was the effect on agriculture, on infrastructure, if indeed this is actually reported by countries. And the challenge for us is actually ensuring that when the disaster reporting is actually undertaken post events, that we're actually getting into the level of detail where we're actually starting to understand this. And one of the areas in which we're actually using these data sets is actually to help with the risk assessment work, to look at how have disasters actually impacted countries, communities, and people. The Pacific Risk Information System was actually set up to try and host data sets that came out of the PICRAFI program. And what this was really to look at how we could make accessible on an open data platform the historical hazard data, historical disaster data, but as well some of the probabilistic hazard maps that came about out of the program. And again, the whole point of this was the idea was to actually make these data sets available so that you could then use it onwards. What we found though was that even 10 years after we'd first launched the Pacific Risk Information System, that the understanding and the access to it was actually quite low. And there's this missing gap around how do we actually start to take data and information and start to drive some of the applications. And though this initial work was done to inform or to develop risk profiles for the Pacific Island countries, what we also realized was that by making these data sets accessible, that they will also be used to develop customized information products that could then be used by partners and even by technical agencies. In a number of instances, the profiles developed using these data sets have gone on to inform and to inform the investments that countries have actually then sought through our development partners. So how do we get to access? And one of the challenges that countries always come back to us is, you develop all these beautiful products, but how do we actually access it, and who keeps track of all the different URLs that you're putting up? And this is where this piece of work is actually trying to get to with the Pacific Resilience Nexus. So we're going to try and in the process of actually consolidating the Pacific Disaster Net, the Pacific Risk Information System, and a number of other information repositories around the region to actually make this available and accessible to you. And we have actually learned over the years of things that we do need to ensure, one of which is actually consolidation, making sure that data and information is actually accessed through a single interface, so that there's some efficiencies in that. The need for collaboration with partners, and in this case also with the countries and the custodians of the data that we're using, and through this collaborative process also develop some use cases and applications, and we'll hear a little bit more about this later on today when Julie gets talking. Data management, I think, is one that we've also been talking to, and the idea is that the one bit of it is actually producing the information, but then how do you actually make sure that it's usable for across other purposes? And the one thing that comes up quite a lot with our conversations with our counterparts is, do you guys have LiDAR data for our countries? And often these data sets are so big that they can't actually exist on an online repository. So is there any way that we could actually just catalog them and make these available so that you can actually see where there's existing data that's available for use or to request and access? Tailored information products, I've mentioned this earlier. The bit that we've actually realized with risk information is the overall need for a sustainability plan, just so that we're actually able to maintain, to update the information contained. And that's it from me. Nakavalevu.
Okay, thank you so much, Litea, for this overview of these three initiatives. And I think this will be highly valuable for all participants to look up and reflect upon, and we'll come back to a discussion of this and some question and answers in a while. But before that, I would like to re-invite Stuart Fraser to talk about ADB's engagement in disaster risk information. As I mentioned previously, Stuart has been helping the Pacific Regional Department with identifying existing disaster risk information in the region, and then also helping and informing the design of risk assessments. Stuart, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, ADB obviously recognizes that the implications of climate change on sustainable development in the region, so it's committed to mainstreaming climate change and disaster risk management and environmental considerations in ADB operations, and also to scaling up climate finance. So just to focus on the Pacific approach and how that relates to this, this topic. So the Pacific approach 2021 to 25 guides the operations of ADB across the Pacific. And it highlights vulnerability to shocks as a core development challenge. And it flags within that the lack of data, uncertainty, and capacity constraints can severely limit coping capacity to plan for and react to acute and prolonged climate risks, and threatens the long-term development efforts. So just calling out one part of the Pacific approach, focuses on disaster risk reduction. and recognises that climate and disaster resilience are at the core of ADB's work. And really, support to disaster risk reduction and climate change needs to be more comprehensive to address the underlying causes of vulnerability to climate shocks. So within the Pacific approach, ADB is supporting the collection and analysis of risk data for use in policy decisions and planning, supporting the development of adaptation pathways and helping countries better access international finance. It's providing post-disaster funding, contingent financing, and looking at other disaster risk financing options as well, and expanding climate change support to country and regional levels. So within that framework, all of those activities are underpinned by risk information, and risk information and risk assessments provide evidence for these activities. So moving on to the next slide, some of the technical work that ADB has been undergoing recently include a review of latest research and evidence on sea level rise since 2013, and recommending a precautionary approach to including sea level rise in risk assessment, which includes using a 1 meter sea level rise scenario, which ADB has been doing in line with other organizations since the IPCC report in 2013, but also adding in different levels of sea level rise for short and medium term projects, for long term projects, and also projects with a lifetime beyond 2000 and between 2100. Beyond 2100, recognizing that sea level rise will continue beyond that. We've also been working on multi-hazard risk assessments, and these were informed by a review of risk information that was available that we conducted towards the end of 2019-20. So we've completed a risk assessment for Tongatapu. That was completed in 2021. And included earthquake, cyclone, pluvial and coastal flood and tsunami, with a focus on informing urban development. So the outputs of that risk information comprised the outputs that I presented on the previous slides. So hazard maps and exposure mapping and risk estimates across multiple sectors for structures, infrastructure and population. Now the time frame of that analysis began in late 2019 with developing the idea and the scope of the project, completing 2 years later in 21. And at the conclusion of the project, so ADB and Tonga government hold digital copies of all the risk data sets produced and reports describing the technical approaches and the results for each step in that risk assessment have been are made available on the ADB website, and we'll provide links following this event. Also, the newly completed exposure database, or a data set that we developed, was released to researchers very quickly for use in analysis of the Hunga Hapai volcano eruption, to analyze the impacts of both the eruption and the tsunami. So while we didn't model the effects of volcanic ash and volcanic generated tsunami, the exposure data was ready for analysis by others because we'd prepared it specifically for risk assessment. So crucially, within that project, ADB worked closely with multiple agencies, ministries in the Tonga government to develop the scope of the analysis and have workshops to collaborate throughout the project for the government to review results, provide feedback on how they compared to their experience and expectations, and provide an opportunity for the consultants and ADB to learn from the government, and help also familiarize the end users of the information with the methods, the scope and the outputs before they were actually delivered. And there's ongoing conversation with ADB and government now about how to communicate those results onwards to communicate to communities to maximize the application of that risk information. There'll be a community-based DRM program, and those results will be fed into a climate and disaster resilient urban development strategy under a joint ADB and Government of Tonga resilient urban project. And we're following up that analysis with similar approaches, with analysis focused more on adaptation within Luganville and Vanuatu and on Rarotonga in Cook Islands. And obviously the Pacific Knowledge series that we're having today connects with these technical activities to share information that ADB is producing, to learn from you about how we can be developing and communicating risk information more effectively to maximize its impact in the region. So a very quick summary of what ADB is doing. Back to you, Alexandra.
Thank you very much, Stuart, for this overview and of ADB's interest and engagement in disaster risk information. I would really like to open up the floor now to questions to the speakers. I see there's already some really good questions that have been put. Let me go to the first one, if I can, which is from Rohit Karan Singh in Fiji. So they're asking, to have the best and reliable information, what are the important tools and resources a country should have? Maybe I can ask Litea to give a brief perspective on that. It's a big question, of course.
Sure. Thanks, Rohit, for that. Well, in the discussions that we've had, at least around risk information and risk assessments, what we were very clear about was that the technology shouldn't be the thing driving it. That we should first understand the purpose and then work backwards from there around identifying what were the data needs. So for instance, the investments in the getting high resolution, bathymetry topography, getting monitoring data, Stuart's earlier presentation around some of the various inputs into a risk assessment. So it's always a good starting point to maybe first understand the context and then to go, okay, what do we now need to move forward?
Thank you, Litea. I think the next question from John Rubin is somewhat in that vein, in terms he's focusing more on the methodology, whether there's a specific methodology or that maybe has worked particularly well or that is in place to conduct risk and vulnerability assessments in the Pacific. And Litea, sorry for again asking you to reflect on that briefly.
Sure, thanks, Alexandra, and thanks again, John, for this. So Julie's presentation after this will talk a little bit about some of the work that's been done. The approaches can be quite different. I mean, we've also looked at the more the scientific approaches to actually assessing and evaluating risk. There's also participatory approaches to being able to do this, community-based approaches for vulnerability assessments. That tend to be done with communities, and it's actually understanding which of those are actually going to be able to provide you the answers that you need. So you don't want to invest heavily in trying to actually acquire new data if what you're actually trying to address is going to be something that you could do quite easily with through an engagement process or the other way around. So it's that's sort of finding out which of those approaches are going to be best fit for what you're selecting. And I'm sorry that it's not as direct an answer as you may have wanted.
Thank you, Litea, for this. I'm going to jump to Afuafu Kautoke, and would like to ask her to maybe put on her microphone and ask the question herself, if you're comfortable with that.
Thank you, Alexandra. it's not really a question, but it's something that I am looking forward to learning from the others. I know that there has been sharing of how to access disaster risk information, and I'm noting that. But I'm also trying to get from the learning here on how that can be linked to education development work. Here in the Institute of Education, we are in the process of establishing an educational policy and planning hub. And with our work, we work closely with the ministries and departments of education in the region. And disaster has been affecting education at all levels. And we have not been planning well for that. There has been schools that are closed down due to the drought season, no water. I mean, they have been experiencing that, for years, but there hasn't been any changes. For the case here in Tonga, with the tsunami and with the volcanic eruption, we were forced, to start thinking about it, but we haven't incorporated disaster risk knowledge and information in our work. But since us here in the Pacific and our vulnerability to all the impact of disaster, we need to plan better for that. So I'm just looking forward to learning from you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Afu, for this interesting perspective from a sector point of view. Before we go to the next two speakers, I would like to again ask you in the chat box to reflect on particular things that you would like to know about the Partner 2 project and about information needs for coastal adaptation. So if you want to reflect on that, please put that in the chat box, and we'll go back to these questions and maybe further questions as we break after the next two speakers. Next speaker is Julie Ungaro. She joins us from the National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research. She's a climate scientist and the group manager for climate data and applications at NIWA's Wellington office. She has 12 years of experience of working in risk analytics, disaster risk management, climate change adaptation, and other related topics in the region, and has particular expertise in stakeholder engagement, in participatory research and capacity building. Julie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. So I'm going to be speaking on the Partner 2 project, which is the Pacific Risk Tool for Resilience project, phase 2. So you might have been familiar with the Partner 1 project, which took place from 2016 through 2019 in the region. And this is being scaled up, and it's now the Partner 2 project involving 6 countries across the region. So the Partner 2 project aims to support 6 Pacific Island countries to deliver on Goal 1 of the FRDP, or the Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific, as well as their commitments under the Paris Agreement and the Sendai Framework. So the goal of the project is that Pacific Island countries are more resilient to the impacts of climate change through risk-informed decision-making. And what does success look like through the project? That risk information is being produced to support effective decision-making in the 6 countries, that the 6 countries have the skills and knowledge to utilize climate risk information, and that regional and peer-to-peer support is available and coordinated across Pacific Island countries. So the project is funded by MFAT, which is the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. It's jointly implemented between SPC and NIWA over a period of 3 years. So it started last July in 2021 and goes through 2024. And like I said, there's 6 Pacific Island countries involved, which is Samoa, Tonga, Vanuatu, Cook Islands, Tuvalu, and the Marshall Islands. So the focus of the project will be on climatic hazard risks, in particular tropical cyclone risks, as well as drought. So for Vanuatu and Samoa, the project will build on the Partner 1 project, which took place from 2016 through 2019 there. For Tuvalu and the Marshall Islands, the project will build on the Riskscape drought model, which was developed under Partner 1. And for Tonga and the Cook Islands, they are new to the project, so we're working with them to develop their risk information needs and priorities. So the Partner 2 approach focuses on country-led risk assessment priorities that will define the process for integrating risk assessment into national decision-making. And this will involve using risk tools such as Riskscape and working with country and regional risk databases and frameworks. And this process of making risk-informed decisions will be supported by peer-to-peer support networks, technical support from SBC and NIWA, as well as capacity development for risk assessment. For the Partner 2 governance arrangements, the central government functions include sharing risk information needs and priorities through national steering committees. And then the technical line ministries will be linked through cross-government support networks, such as GIS users groups across the countries, and will develop and share decision-relevant risk information back to the central government and across the region. Some examples of national risk assessment priorities might include assessing the impact of climate change, impact-based forecasts for existing early warning systems, disaster preparedness and response, infrastructure planning, land use and development planning, and agriculture or drought risk. So understanding and integrating risk assessment into in-country decision-making processes will be framed around use cases defined by the countries. And these use cases will then inform how decision-relevant information is presented and what data from local, regional, and global data sets local, regional, and global data sets is used and run through Riskscape, which is a risk tool. So some examples of use cases include information and data to support climate finance proposals, reporting mechanisms for monitoring changing exposure and risk levels, as well as rapid post-disaster damage and needs assessment. And we're currently in the process of defining these use cases with the countries through consultations in country where possible. So now a bit on Riskscape. So what is Riskscape? It's a open source software that assesses natural or other hazard impacts, including for multi-hazard risk analysis. It has a flexible modeling framework that can calculate exposure and impacts for any hazard. It was developed by NIWA and GNS Science in New Zealand, and it's used across New Zealand, such as by the Earthquake Commission and for national flood modeling. And Riskscape is one option of a risk decision support tool for Pacific Island countries, and it can be used in any country. So Riskscape in Partner 2 will take hazard layers such as information about tropical cyclone hazards, so coastal and river flooding, as well as wind, plus sea level rise and drought as the hazard layers, and then overlay them with exposure layers. So this is information on assets, so buildings, people, and so on. And then vulnerability models will be derived from the literature and from work done previously in the region. And then impacts will be displayed as tailored maps, tables, reports, and dashboards. The project will also focus on national and regional databases. And this will include conducting an inventory of risk data that already exists, as well as standardizing exposure, hazard, and impact data collected after a disaster so that it can be easily used in risk assessment throughout the Pacific going forward. For communities of practice and training, we're setting up peer-to-peer communities of practice at both the decision maker and technical level in the countries and across the countries. And we're also doing this in collaboration with other projects that we're already working with, which includes PREP, PCRAFI2, and Gov4Res. For delivering on training. We're planning trainings on risk tools and analysis for the communities of practice, as well as providing the USP Disaster Risk Management Certificate for training for all 6 of the countries involved in the project. So for the project timeline, SBC and NIWA hosted a project inception meeting in March of this year. And since then, we've been working with the countries to define their governance arrangements and risk assessment priorities. And now we've started on year 2 of the project, where we are focusing more in depth on the different outputs, which you can see there for the project. So in the Partner 2 design, we've incorporated some of the lessons learned from Partner 1 project, the pilot project, which includes the need to embed knowledge and ownership in both regional and national planning agencies, including the Ministry of Finance and Climate Change. And this includes working with both high-level decision makers and technical staff in countries to develop the communities of practice, to collaborate with related projects and programs from the beginning, which we're trying our best to through collaborations that I mentioned previously, and to first identify the national needs for climate risk information, and then design the use cases from there in order to meet the country needs from the beginning. So that's our first priority, is to define those national needs. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julie, for this excellent overview of the Partner 2 projects. I'm sure there are questions in the audience. You've dwelt upon some very interesting aspects of capacity building. But before we break for questions and answers, I would like to introduce the next speaker, and that's Arthur Webb. He's the Chief Technical Advisor of the Tuvalu Coastal Adaptation Project by UNDP. So Arthur is very well known in the region. He has over 30 years of experience in the Pacific in more than 14 countries. Very strong climate change science background. For instance, he's been one of the authors, or the lead author, I should say, of the 2014 IPCC assessment report focusing on small islands. Arthur, we are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Let's get started with the screen share. Okay. Could everybody confirm they can see the screen okay?
Yes, thanks.
Great, thank you.
If you could share the, if you could switch it to slideshow mode, that would be great.
Oh, I thought I had.
If you've got 2 screens, it might be sharing the wrong screen, maybe. Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, very good. Okay, sorry about that. There's always a technical hitch with these things, isn't there? And it would always be me that manages to do it. So, look, I was asked to speak to you today about data needs in relation to coastal adaptation and coastal risk, I guess. And of course, that's a really broad question, and we've got 7 minutes. So I thought I would zero in on one thing that I think is so crucially important, and I see it as such a gap across the region, although we have had a couple of examples today where that data gap has been filled. So essentially, it's topography and bathymetry, or nearshore shallow water bathymetry. That is so important because, in essence, whether we live on high islands, in this case, that's commonly called an almost atoll, so a mixture of high island and atoll island, or a true atoll, let's say of Tarawa, people across the Pacific predominantly live in nearshore low-lying coastal settlements. And that means one of our chief drivers of risk, hazard, is of course mid-ocean conditions. And then when you overlay that with climate change and the lifting of baselines such as sea level, it makes the low-lying nature of these islands extremely vulnerable. And yet our understanding of these is actually very poor. We talk about them in generalizations without really bothering to collect the data that's going to provide just a better understanding of that vulnerability. This next slide gives you a graphic illustration of what I'm talking about. And this is borrowed from colleagues in SPC. In essence, on the right-hand side here, we have a LiDAR, a very high resolution model of Ngunnawanga Island, which shows topography and nearshore bathymetry. That's only been available since 2019. And as it turns out, Tuvalu is the only Pacific atoll nation that has actually got adequate baselines to support this kind of analysis of their risk. On the left is what the type of product that's usually used to understand topography. In this case, it's the shuttle radar topography mission data. And the problem with this is summarized in this little table bracketed in red. If you look at the mean elevation, so the mean height of land above mean sea level, the poor quality data suggests mean elevation of land is 9.2 meters. So the height of a large coconut tree. The real data tells us is 1.5 meters above sea level, nearly a 10 times difference in elevation. This is so important because consistently, and my own agency, ADB, others are all guilty of this, and for a range of reasons. We will invest money in inundation modeling, be it wave or bathtub style modeling, all sorts of inundation or hazard modeling. Put the bulk of those funds into the modeling applications, but we don't invest in collecting the baseline that those models run on. And I'm afraid unless we get sensible and start doing that, our models often really are not worth much. This is I kept this one fairly public rather than making it too specific people in the room, but this is a output from Climate Central, and they're showing inundation in the left-hand side here with 10 centimeters of sea level rise, which by the way, we've already had. And it says the entire island is inundated. Now, I've been to Funafuti many times. It's not yet completely inundated. So this is just categorically wrong, yet this is public data and in use. The real data tells a much more nuanced story. This is, again, the LiDAR data from 2019. And we can simulate, for example, 0.4 meters, which might be a 2050 scenario, or 1 meter, which might be a 2100 sea level scenario, and get a far more nuanced understanding of what inundation looks like. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's a sobering story either way, whether we're talking about that type of inundation mapping or this one. But note, for example, the oceanside rampart and how that's been persistent throughout, potentially. That gives us crucial information to work with in adaptation planning. So to take that a step further, these baselines were collected in Tuvalu across the nation and indeed here in Funafuti to support adaptation. And without it, we could not have justified the design height and the design horizon for the reclamation that we're building there. And it's progressed now into using that exact same data to support long-term and far larger scale adaptation planning in Tuvalu. Now, as I showed, I've spoken about Tuvalu, but in fact, this really is about much more than just Tuvalu. There are all of the high islands where we have low-lying communities, and we really need to get this sort of quality baseline information to assist us with adaptation across those. And just the final slide there, if you're considering coastal hazards, coastal adaptation, as most Pacific islands are, please do get that expert help. SPC is a key one here in terms of understanding what data is available to you. Remember, please don't compromise on these sorts of baselines because they're crucial to our understanding of sea level rise and marine hazards, be they from storms or whatever. And let's design the acquisition of these baselines into our projects, knowing that not only will they support the project we're working on, but that they then get used in a whole suite of development, coastal infrastructure, environmental survey, just any number of applications. And that's what we've seen in Tuvalu, that the investment in LiDAR for them has just reaped massive benefits, and it is used across every division and department in government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arthur, for this really thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure we'll come back to this in our discussion and in our wrap-up as well. But before we do that, I would like actually to invite one of our participants to put on his camera. It's John Rubin from the Climate and Development Services of the Vanuatu Meteorological Services. And he's going to share some reflections on risk information and meteorological forecasting. Over to you, John.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra. Hope you all can hear me loud and clear.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you. I'll be briefly speaking on from a meteorological forecasting perspective. Basically, I will be speaking on the different approach that most of the national met services around the Pacific are using, which is the conventional or systematic forecasting approach. And this approach system is only it only predicts when extreme weather event will strike and what will most likely okay, but unfortunately it lacks the ability to predict how the weather will affect communities on the ground. And that's why we from the meteorological forecasting perspective, I think it is best to start using the impact-based forecasting approach, which I think Fiji and Tonga are already using. And this impact-based forecasting, it changes the focus of forecasting from what the weather will be to what the weather will do. So in that sense, it addresses the different impacts that the communities will face with the different climate events that we are forecasting. So in adopting an impact-based forecasting approach, it will be crucially safeguard our communities across the region, and it will help elevate our communities' level of preparedness as it redefine how we interpret information that fits into our decision-making processes. And it will also help build resilient communities filled with families that know what to expect and how to effectively respond to extreme weather events as well as other natural disasters. So I think this is an important area that I want to discuss with us this morning. So I will give a classic example that sometimes the challenge is the language that the Met services are using. Sometimes it is not very clear. For example, most of the time you will hear on the radio the wind will be 60 knots. Instead of saying 60 knots, it is best to say we are going to have a wind which can uproot trees. So that will help communities to really know what to expect and to well prepare in advance before the event actually occurred. So I think, yeah, I have only 2 minutes I am only given 2 minutes to share. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for this reflection. And I think it's something that it's a bit of a segue as well to the next session, where we'll talk about applications. And I think what you raised in terms of impact-based forecasting is a very important one indeed. We would like now to open the floor to questions to the presenters. And there's one, I think that I'm seeing to Julie that actually comes from John. And it's a question with regard to some of the successes, the progress that's been made under the Partner One project for Vanuatu, or maybe other countries as well.
Sure.
Julie?
So I can focus a bit on the Partner One successes in Vanuatu and where we got through to in the pilot project there, and what we're planning to build on in Partner Two. So in Partner One, we had 3 different case studies in Vanuatu, and these focused on drought and heavy rainfall and the impact on crops in Santo Island. So these impact tables and impact maps were then shared with the NDMO as well as the Department of Agriculture, and also with NGOs in Santo. So we went up to Santo to both collect that data and then also to share that information back to them. We also focused on modeling ashfall from Mount Yasser and Tanna Island and the impacts on people and buildings as well as crops. And that information's been shared with the NDMO and VMGD. And VMGD was involved in collecting that data and developing those impact models. We also focused on coastal and river flooding in Lanakal and Tanna to inform land use planning. And we shared that information with the NDMO as well as the Department of Local Government and the Lanakal local government, and developed maps of what areas were high risk for flooding in Lanakal, both from coast and river flooding. And then we also completed a training of trainers on disaster risk analysis, which was then led by Vanuatu national government staff. So we trained trainers there, and then they did the training back to other participants on disaster risk analysis. And that training is going to be built on in the Partner 2 project by making it online training modules that can be rolled out across the Pacific. So I think that's a brief summary of what we did. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Julie, for that summary. There's a second question from Stuart. Would you like to come online, show your face and ask the question?
Sure, I can show my face again. Yeah, I was just wondering, Arthur, if you're able to elaborate on how Tuvalu came to have LiDAR for the islands. As we at ADB, we've restricted the geographic scope of our risk assessments based around the presence of LiDAR. So we were able to do Tonga Tapu, but not the other islands in so much detail, and we're focusing on Luganville, which has LiDAR, but that restricts the quality of the analysis we can do along the South Santo Road, which we'd like to achieve. So we've been looking for LiDAR from other projects. So I'd like to know how Tuvalu came to have LiDAR, and whether other countries can follow the same model to access it, obtain it.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. That really so emphasizes what I tried to get across all too quickly, that there you were able to work in Tonga Tapu, but not in neighboring islands. And it's simply because the baseline data wouldn't support it. And I guess I would congratulate you on recognizing that and not pretending you could undertake that work elsewhere. In the case of Tuvalu, no, it was not designed into the project. We had budget to undertake succinct survey where coastal infrastructure was planned. And what we did was looked at the overall approach of that project, which is a national project, and it's intended to provide national solutions to risk and adaptation. And we realized quickly that, you know, small, succinct, isolated surveys don't do that. They often don't even really link that elevation data to sea level. So we managed to amalgamate our budgets and undertake the national LiDAR survey for the same budget that several small, succinct surveys would have cost because of the logistical effort and difficulty of getting a qualified team out onto the outer islands. So it literally was a matter of not budget constraints, but actually understanding what the baseline conditions were and what the technology was that could fill that gap. So, you know, it's not difficult. We just have to make sure that we get adequate technical partners such as SPC, or there's parts of ADB, parts of UNDP, parts of most of these agencies where this kind of assistance can be given. But I would say, having said that, sorry, this is a long answer, but it's important. I've just seen another LiDAR survey undertaken in the region. Excellent data, but unfortunately, the terms of reference was not written by someone who really understood the technology. And it has crucial flaws, which means we now cannot relate that LiDAR data to sea level. It can be done if we add more work in later, but you know, it would be so easy not to make these sorts of fundamental mistakes. So I would say, just if you're planning this type of work, get expert help. Get expert help. Let's build it into our projects. Let's really get the brilliant foundation for all this other work. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Arthur. These are really some great recommendations to everybody in the room. I'm looking at Tandemic and asking whether we have time for one more question on the LiDAR issue.
Let's go for it.
Yes, okay, because I think Doug has another question. And Doug, would you like to come on and ask the question?
Thanks, Alexandra. So just thinking about this, all the LiDAR data collection has been done on a rather ad hoc basis. I mean, we have Samoa and Tuvalu, the only two countries that have a complete LiDAR coverage. Everywhere else, there's only bits and pieces of that. Now, I mean, given how critical such data sets are, is it time that we actually need a strategic regional program of LiDAR collection and a vision? You know, can we have all inhabited islands collected by 2025? That's probably not going to happen, but 2030, say, it would be great to have it by 2025. You know, that is going to need probably kind of the development and donor support community to come together to make that happen. But given that, you know, in the 25 years I've been working in the region, you know, we're still talking about, you know, the lack of good topography information being a real constraint to making proper risk and adaptation decision making. We really do need to get, you know, kind of make substantial changes kind of quickly in this. So I guess the question opening up, I don't know, to ADB or to Arthur, you know, do we actually need to think about a more strategic approach to collecting this?
Arthur, would you like to react to that?
Yeah, please. Sorry to elbow my way in, everybody. I'm sure probably there's lots of passion around this, but look, what Doug says is so hugely important. And the reason is economies of scale. For me to mobilize a proper survey aircraft out to Tuvalu costs a lot of money. And then you've got the actual survey costs associated with it. To mobilize a team like this regionally, you would lessen your costs so much, and there would be massive advantages to seeing all of this collected in a systematic and similar way. Then we can all use it in a known way. We all understand the quality of the data, what it can and can't give us. Whereas, just as Doug says, little bits and pieces here and there from this operator, that operator, they're often not controlled properly. They're more or less useless if you're really going to make an investment in infrastructure. So completely agree with Doug. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Arthur. We'll certainly come back to these issues. I'm currently driven by our scheduling and time management, so I'll hand over to Carl for some participant reflections. Carl?
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much, Alexandra. And so what I'd like for us to do is we're going to get everyone to share maybe one reflection, one takeaway from today. And so I'm going to just put up on the screen a slide. And so my question for us is, what is your one takeaway from today? We're going to post a link. We've posted a link into the chat for a Menti. So go ahead, click that link, and then share your one takeaway. And I'm going to put up a board that is going to show all of those takeaways. I'm sure that you have seen something, you've heard something that really was thought-provoking or was interesting from today. What is your one takeaway? Go ahead and click the link and add it to our board. I'm going to share it, and we'll take just a few moments for people. All right, let's take a look at what are some of the things that are coming in. Riskscape, LiDAR, the regional LiDAR strategy, correct baseline information, the importance of baseline information, impact-based approach, Pacific holistic approach on LiDAR. So that is all, resonating really strongly. The multiple applications of risk information. It was great to see these use cases and data training and risk data training evolving. Great job to partner. Data is very important, and would like to see that regional LiDAR project soon, partner 1 and partner 2, as well as the LiDAR strategy. For a risk assessment to be truly useful, there is a need to first understand its purpose for going forward. Baseline quality again, and what our concerns may be the same, but our interventions are different. Much more depends on reliable and in-depth data for better results, to have proper risk assessment information, and then the promotion of national hazard-specific hazard assessment strategy. So thanks to the 15 people who have contributed these takeaways. These are really fantastic takeaways from our session. I'm going to pass things back to Alexandra just to help us wrap up for today. Alexandra, over to you.
Yes, I will try. I think the participants did a fantastic job at actually wrapping up the main takeaways from this session, which I think has been really rich. There's a lot of specifics we hopefully can get into in the next sessions. So we've heard what different agencies are doing in terms of risk information and risk assessment, but I think there's been some common themes that in their own way each presenter has highlighted. And I think this is the user focus. So engaging in this type of information to have a clear idea about who the user of the information is and what they need the information for. The other thing that I think has come out so strongly, both from Litea's presentation as well as Julie's, is the importance of use cases. And yeah, I'd be very interested to also follow further, the Tuvalu project and how the LiDAR information is actually translated into risk information for coastal adaptation. And this would be such a strong use case, I think, and also to bring home the importance of the LiDAR data sets that Arthur has so passionately talked about. So I think the other thing that's come across is the importance of peer learning. I think this is what we're doing in this risk knowledge series as well, what we're attempting to do. And last but not least, in terms of just this idea about a regional LiDAR strategy, I think hopefully this series can be the start of some more conversations between the different agencies that are working in the region, and how we can complement what we do, how we can use certain fora in the future to further promote the idea. I don't think it's an entirely new idea, but it's definitely something that we all realize is really important. So I'd like to leave it at that. Again, I think the wrap up by the participants was perfect. Let's have a look at what's coming in the next event. So we're really looking forward to having you back. We hope you're all encouraged to come back through this initial event. So we'll talk really about applications in the next event. We're looking at applying risk information, risk insights in resilient development and in adaptation planning. So developing further from today's session. So the session will be on the same day in 2 weeks, August 11th, and it's at 12 to 1:30 p.m. Suva time. And then we'll pause for another 2 weeks and see each other again on August the 25th, and we'll be looking into working together to develop, improve risk information, as well as including community perspectives and experience into the generation of disaster risk information. So that's again at the same time, 12 to 1:30 p.m. Suva time. So thank you so much to the presenters for sharing your experience, the information that's been generated, the projects that you've been working on, and some of the lessons learned. And thanks very much to the participants. We hope to hear more from you in the next sessions and really look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you.